thanks so much for inviting me to come and talk about your work. It's really lovely to be here and to see this exhibition that you've assembled, and to see, I think, some threads and connections from your previous work that I've known over almost 20 years now. And I wonder, maybe we can start by just talking through some of the works that are here. Which should we start with?
Should we start with the oldest? Because the triptych of the triple exposures go back quite a long way. They go back 20 years or more, 23 years or something. The physical aspect of the photograph, I really like that kind of vague, the softness and the texture, the grainy, the grainy vagueness.
But there's something you were saying about like a happy accident, and we were speaking earlier as well about this idea of finding the sublime in the prosaic or in the everyday. That's something that I think that you do in lots of different ways. Like you find the kind of object, like a soulful object, or an object that has some kind of extra meaning attached to it, and it's usually because that object has been handled or has a story or a narrative, whether you know it or not. Actually, maybe if we move on then to the works that are related to the story that's printed behind me, which I think is super interesting. It's very compelling, and I think it also contains some of those threads that we talked about. In terms of it's a story of politics that's related to gender, that's related to like economics, that's to do with the way that people live in a political sense, but it also is like a human story, right?
Yeah, I mean, this amazing story about this group of women who lived in the Curragh, and I think probably they weren't the only women. That wasn't the only place. I think it was happening in maybe other parts of Ireland too, where they were sort of outside. They lived outside of the community and almost formed a commune-like existence where they looked after each other's children, and but they lived wild. They lived in burrows and nests, and but the women in the Curragh, they served the soldiers. They would go in and out of the barracks to make money, and anyway, it's a really, really fascinating story. But and again on so many different layers, because of the history, because of the women's history and the politics involved, but also because of that feral thing about living outside of normality, living literally outside in the wild has always been really fascinating to me. Description of them living in the bushes, living in nests, like they call them, and the women were called wrens. So there's works that are related to that, that are kind of looking at that interplay between the social, the political, the military, and then this like idea of like wildness or So the smaller piece, the piece with the big heavy lump of concrete. The reason I wanted to use the big lump of concrete because it was sort of evocative of the grimness of that sort of era. Even walking around the fort here, that old concrete has a very kind of particular feel,
like a brutal kind of
and then the mosaic, the tiling on the top, the willow pattern is sort of suggestive of the society that they were ostracized, or they weren't ostracized in lots of ways. I think they probably chose not to be part of that, but whatever. Anyway, that was. That's kind of suggestive of that.
Because there's a narrative of like the broken woman. It's like a Victorian narrative that people liked to imagine, like a country girl that had like known sexual congress, whatever, and then was left by her lover and became like a broken thing, or like a discarded thing. So I think that, there's something about the way these fragments or these like collected fragments become something else when they're put together. I think that you have a real eye for those objects, for the like, I suppose there's a conceptual link between them, but this eye for the broken or the discarded that we mentioned before, that's just like threaded through the work. So there are images that are just like taking these like, again, kind of soulful or very beautiful, but used and like damaged in some way, these objects, and like stripping away the background of them and just like highlighting their like quirky kind of beauty. And there's something as well about that's like there's like references obviously to like the absurd or to surrealism or to like different connections between things, taking some of these broken objects and placing them into a different relationship with other objects, that I think is super interesting, but also like a reference to like the Victorian cabinet of curiosities or like I think it's partly about the practice of collecting as well, that you're a person who your artistic practice is threaded through your life in a way, that you're always looking for those objects, for those moments, and you're kind of collecting them up and assembling them. I think there's something about like the box or the dollhouse, or like it's like this little world that you have complete control over in a way. But I feel like for one thing, your works they're more porous than that. They're more kind of open to other influences, or they're actually literally more open than that for the most part. We're right in front of some boxes, but
but they are open.
They're also open,
And I definitely wanted them to be like open. So that, and they're also, there's a darkness about that piece, which I wouldn't ever have really got from Joseph Cornell's work. But this is, it's to do with children being lost in the forest, and it's like it's called Tales from Dogwood, so it's sort of about the darkness of some fairy tales.
So maybe we could think a little bit more, go a little deeper into the object that you've selected, that you've made like a color field, and these particular objects their backgrounds are stripped away and they're placed just on like a colored background, like a plain colored background. Do you want to talk a little bit about why these particular objects, or something about the specifics?
Well, again, it's about the collection. It's about finding an object, and the object becoming meaningful because of the place and the moment in which it was found, apart from the little cow I got on eBay, I suppose. But even then, that has its own meaning. But the two horses have a meaning, and they're broken and they're old, and they have particular beauty because of that, because of their brokenness and their age. And stripping them of everything else and putting them on a very, very bright, vibrant colour is like a kind of a clash of the two, of the image and the background, in a way that sort of brings the image out, and is a sort of a juxtaposition in a kind of a way as well. And
sorry, go ahead.
And the empty tank was just a random thing of beauty that happened on the kitchen table. That it was an empty fish tank that I'd been mending and filled it full of water to see if it leaked, and then took a photograph of it because it was almost glowing on the table. And then when I looked at it more closely, there was so much going on in it, and yet all it was an empty tank. Empty of fish. It was full of water, but there was nothing in the water. It was just glass and water. Yeah. And yet when you look at it,
it's so textured,
so
and it's the color is extremely rich. Yeah. But I think again, what I see happening in these is that these objects, these humble kind of objects or everyday objects, are somehow being elevated or are being
that's what I was trying to say.
Being highlighted or are being, and then you start to build like a narrative, particularly like the toys, the horses, like you build a kind of narrative around those, or like the Velveteen Rabbits, like something that's been like played with and becomes alive somehow, or is like a is more than the object. Yeah. It carries with it a whole set of stories or narratives that you start to spin out in your mind or imagine. I mean, there's so much in the work that we haven't even touched on because it is so layered, and I wonder if you could maybe talk about some of the things to do with that are like pushing at this idea of binaries. So they're pushing at or trying to maybe erode the difference between binaries around gender or around this idea of divisions between animal and human.
Yeah, any kind of identity that has a boundary to it, and playing around with those boundaries and imagining if we were more able to be free of all those dividing lines, and we could choose to identify in any way we wanted as anything, or anybody we wanted to identify as. And the animal-human thing has always been of big interest to me through my life, I think, because I was always really into animals. And so the crow was a pet crow that I had that I was very close to. And I'm very interested in, the Philip Pullman, the children, the elements that come up in children's stories, and the Philip Pullman demons, where each child or each person has an animal, which is very directly related to kind of psyche. I think that's fascinating. And so that's one of the little threads that runs through it all as well. And there can be a darkness to that too.
I think it also, this idea of the erosion of the human-animal divide, or of the kind of gender divide, it sort of sits with something that's in the work as well, that's about it's about dignity, and it's about returning dignity or recognizing the dignity in the other.
Yeah. Yeah, that's true. Yeah. And the respect. Respect for everything, whether it's whole or broken or different, other, or
Thanks so much. That was great.
Thank you, Sarah. Good stuff now.